what's up everybody? Welcome to the Rules of Engagement. As always, I'll be your host, Nick axslav ranish, and today we're going to go over two different matches. One was a Friday match between Rain and Flying, and then next we're going to talk about a couple of games from the Sunday's match, Sase versus Snute. Of course, if you just watched this last great match between Nurtio and Baby Knight, we'll talk about that, go over it, analyze it tomorrow after tomorrow's match. So let's actually just talk about what we're going to talk about in game number 3. Well, first, we're going to go over Rain vs. Flying game 3, then Rain vs. Flying game 4. Those are the two coolest games I thought of that series, and then two of the Sase vs. Snute games as well. Rain vs. Flying game 3 on Cloud Kingdom is going to be DT Rush. We'll talk about how the DT Rush works in Heart of the Swarm. And then the use of Void Rays in PvP. Of course, Void Rays are much stronger now in Heart of the Swarm, and I can go over that briefly for you guys. And then we're going to talk about some unit combinations with Void Rays. So, you know, how you can kind of mix them in with other units, basically. So let's jump into this first game and talk about the DT Rush in Heart of the Swarm. So, taking a look at this from Rain's perspective, Rain, of course, is going to be the red Protoss in this game. And one thing we can notice is Rain's going for that DT Rush, right? We can see it right here. But we can also see that he can move out. Cool thing about Heart of the Swarm, Dark Shrine only costs 150 gas instead of 250. So you can do something like a DT Rush and still make your Gateway army look like it's a relatively normal Gateway force. In Wings of Liberty, if you went DT Rush, you could not be doing this 5-Stalker pressure type build. But in Heart of the Swarm, because you have more that 100 extra gas to play with, means instead of having 3 Stalkers and 3 Zealots, also you can have 5 Stalkers. It looks more like a regular Gateway force. It's a little bit harder for your opponent to tell that you're going Stalkers. Of course, Flying shows some great force fields here and actually gets a good trade. And of course, Flying, being a world-class Protoss, also has that robotic sound away anyway. But many Protosses, especially when you play the ladder, you show them 5 Stalkers, they're going to be afraid of a Blink Rush, a mass Gateway warp in. They're not going to think of DT Rush, and so the DT Rush can do much more damage than it normally could. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about a little bit is what to target with your Dark Templar. So, knowing what to do with Dark Templar is always very, very tough. When you're not sure, when in doubt, spread your Dark Templar out. So, one in natural, one into main. If you spread out your DTs, they're much harder to catch. Of course, your opponent only has one observer. And as they send it, Rain being really good knows it was sent down here, so retreats the Dark Templar. And then, the Dark Templar in the main can continue to do massive damage. Now, if he sends Observer back to the main, right, which is what Rain was anticipating, then all of a sudden this DT here might get this Nexus kill, and that would put him at an enormous advantage going forward in this game. Unfortunately, Flying anticipated this move, deflected that Nexus kill, and is just sacrificing the main for now until he gets a second Observer. But he would have never had to even get that second Observer in the first place if Rain hadn't split up his DTs to try to do the maximum amount of damage. In this case, he actually might have been able to get the Nexus if he just focused it from the start. But you never know exactly how fast your observers are going to be, so if you're ever in doubt, always split up those DTs, as it makes it much harder for your opponent to clear up. As we notice here, he's able to get 8 probe kills and a good amount of mine time lost and soften up this Nexus. So a nice combination of moves there being dealt out by Rain. DTs are much more useful in Heart of Swarm because you can not only make your put on pressure with Stalkers while going DTs because of the higher amount of gas you have available, but also, of course, just knowing how to use them properly is always essential in using those Dark Templar Rush. From here on, the game will normalize for a bit. But the next thing I want to talk about is what Rain's going to do, which is as the game goes on, they're both going to macro up. Rain is going to add in a Stargate in the mid-game situation. And what's interesting about this is normally people open Stargates in PvP, but it's pretty rare to see a Stargate really being utilized like this here in the mid-game transition. Typically because it's about Colossi Wars and Wings of Liberty. But in Heart of the Swarm, one thing that's really cool is you can go Void Rays for your mid and late game unit composition. And they're much stronger versus Stalkers than they were in Wings of Liberty. Let me actually, you know what, let me close this guy here. And we're going to bring up this guy, and I can actually tell you guys exactly why the Void Rays are stronger than they were in Wings of Liberty against Stalkers. And it's basically all down to their stats. Knowing unit stats is very essential in Starcraft 2. Knowing unit stats will tell you that the Hydrus is still not a great unit against most Gateway or any Protoss composition, because even though it's faster, it still loses to most of those units. Maybe combined with great concaves like we saw Nurture use in that last series, it can work, but it's usually not an ideal unit because of its stats. Also, if you know stats, you can tell what units Hellbats are good against, what units they're not good against, why they're strong, etc. Now, the Void Ray stats is important to understand how they're changed. It's not just, oh, they have this anti-armored ability, so now they beat armored units. It doesn't really exactly always work that way. I mean, Stalkers do bonus damage to armored, yet they lose to most armored units. It all is about the exact numbers. So you look at the new Void Rays. Against armored, their base damage is 10. And their base attack rate is 0.5. Right? They attack every 0.5 seconds they attack, doing 10 damage each attack. Now, the old Void Ray did 8 damage to armored. And its attack rate was 0.6. So even without prismatic alignment, we can see this is 20 DPS, 20 damage per second. You just divide it by the attack rate. And 8 divided by 0.6 is going to be like 13 point something, right? I think it's 13 point something. All right, we'll just say 13. It's 13 and a third, but whatever. We'll say 13, make it simple. So we can see they're already 50% more DPS without the upgrade. Now the upgrade is +6. So now all of a sudden, you get 32 damage per second. So all of a sudden your Void Rays are doing like 2.5 to 3 times the damage that they used to do. So we can see here Void Rays, always, if you want to know how units change, look at the stats, do the math. It's really not that complex math. I mean, if you can figure out a game like Starcraft, you can figure out how to figure out damage per seconds. And then you'll understand the way the units work much stronger. So Void Rays are much, much, much better against armored units in Heart of the Swarm. Just think of it that way. And now, as far as that reflects into a gameplay, all of a sudden Void Rays, let's back this up just a little bit here. Void Rays now are units that actually beat Stalkers cost for cost. Okay? Because they're so much stronger against army units, they beat Stalkers cost for cost. Now, the thing to consider though, it doesn't mean, oh, I just make Void Rays and I win, right? Because there's 2 factors here. Let's pause real quick. Check this out. Void Rays, you got to build from a Stargate, right? Stargate, 1 Void Ray every 60 seconds. We're going to not count Chrono Boost because both players can Chrono Boost all their buildings, right? So it should equalize out. 1 Void Ray every 60 seconds. Warp Gates can warp in a Stalker every, it's the cooldown's like 32 seconds, I think. Something like 33 seconds. So, and it's front-loaded, right? So you get the Stalker, then you have to wait for the cooldown. So you're a full rally cycle ahead, and it produces twice as fast, and Warp Gates are much cheaper and easier to produce than Stargates. So, while Void Rays beat Stalkers cost for cost, in the mid-game, Stalkers will beat Void Rays because you can easily get more Stalkers, way outmass them, than you can get Void Rays. So, you got to be very careful in the mid-game using Void Rays. They can't beat Stalkers because you won't have equal numbers, or you won't have the same amount of resources into your Void Rays as they will in Stalkers because of the production capability difference. So when you're doing a push like this, right, you gotta think of what should I mix with my, I mean, I might have 1, 2, or 3 Void Rays. My opponent can have 0 Stalkers, but in a split second he can warp in 6, right? So my opponent can easily deal with my Void Rays just by mass Stalker warp in. How can I support my units to deal with these Stalkers? Now, it's kind of easy to say, okay, I should get all these Immortals because Immortals beat Stalkers. But the important thing to consider here is your opponent is not going to have just Stalkers, right? We look at his army, he's going to have a lot of Zealots, a lot of other ground units. And in ground army battles, in PvP, what really decides who wins the ground battle is whoever loses their Zealot line first, right? So if you are relying on your ground units to support your Void Rays against the Stalkers, you've got to break your opponent's Zealot line. And if you want to break your opponent's Zealot line, you need to make units that are good versus Zealots, right? So this is where you focus on Zealots and Archons or Colossi. Of course, you can't really afford Colossi, but Zealots and Archons. You do not want to focus too much on Immortals and Stalkers, because if you get too many Immortals and Stalkers, the problem is yes, they could be good versus your opponent's Stalkers, but they're going to get tangled up in Zealots and never kill them. So you'll never get to your opponent's Stalkers, so it's a moot point that they're good against the Stalkers. As we can see here in this battle coming up here, even if you're in a situation where you've got all those immortals, the army size actually significantly favors Rain here, right? He's 1,000 more resources in his army than his opponent. But as we come into this battle, we all of a sudden have a problem. Let me actually close this baby and open this guy. So if you get into a battle here, right, what I want you guys to look at is going to be whose zealots die first. Let's actually jump back in here and keep an idea on the unit count. And we can see right now the units that kill zealots, right? Flying has got a lot of resources and units that'll kill his opponent's zealot line, whereas only these 10 zealots are Rain's only anti-zealot troops, right? So when we're talking about the units, who's going to lose their front row first? Whoever loses their front row first is going to be the player that, of course, will have their more important units very, very exposed to their opponent's ground units. So we jump into the game and pay attention to what happens in this battle. Even though Rain has a superior force, because his opponent has greater zealot count, even though some of them aren't even in the battle, greater archon count, his zealots, all of a sudden, these immortals, you think they're good against stalkers, right? He's got like 5 of them, but there's no way they can get through. There's massive zealot count here coming out from flying. The zealots can easily deal with the immortals. The immortals can't get at the stalkers, not to mention the archons, of course. But even if the archons weren't there at this point, a mass warp into stalkers like this would clear out these void rays without a problem, while the zealots are still being tried to deal with by the mortals. The mortals just don't work very well in this composition. So Rain had a huge advantage coming into the battle, a much stronger army, a better economy, an advantage from the DT rush, but yet the battle went Flying's way because of a superior unit composition. Now this game will go on for a while, and Rain actually does end up winning this game, but it's a very long and tricky game. The bottom line is that the Void Rays are a great unit, and Rain actually ended up winning that game using the Void Rays in the late game. But in the mid game, your Void Rays, you're not going to have the Void Ray count to deal with stalkers on their own, so you've got to make sure your ground army can break their zealot line and support those Void Rays. So you really want to focus on zealots and archons, and or some of your own colossi would be great as well. Of course, you've got to watch out for someone blink stalker migrating around. Into opening, you want a couple immortals, just so you don't die to blink stalkers. But you do not want to invest everything into immortals. Having 5 immortals and only 10 zealots and no archons is a very good army for defending a choke point, not an army to go out and fight into open where you can get swarmed over by your opponent's zealots, which Void Rays aren't so great against. So, recap that game. Void Rays are great in PvP, but make sure your composition supports them. Void Rays and Immortals don't really have much synergy between themselves because they both counter kind of the same unit. They both counter the stalkers. So we're going to take a short break and be going on to game number 4 between Rain versus Flying.